Group B, the Wild West of auto racing. Once upon a time, a younger, more innocent version of myself made a video about how crazy Formula One used to be in the 1980s. How it was fast, how it was dangerous, how it was special. That was before I knew about the absolute absurdity of Group B. The Killer Bees, the era of rally that really was too dangerous to exist. They went 0 to 60 faster than a Bugatti, had doors made out of Kevlar to save weight, and it was so wild that teams had therapists and psychiatrists on retainer to deal with the trauma that was rally in the 80s. The Group B class was first introduced for the 1982 World Rally Championship, and with effectively no rulebook, teams and engineers were free to let their imaginations run wild. If your car had 4 wheels, a closed roof, and 2 seats, you could race. For the 1982 season, the FIA basically threw the entire rulebook out the window and said, let's go racing. The Audi Quattro, the Lancia 037, the Peugeot 205, some of the most glorious race cars ever made and some of the most iconic names in car culture. In the 1980s, the FIA wanted to turn more people onto the world of rally. They wanted more manufacturers, more crowds, and more of the spotlight. They figured that the best way to do this would be to create a whole new class of rally that gave manufacturers the freedom to do whatever they wanted to do. They could have as much power as they wanted, they could use any new exotic material that they wanted, they could bring any new technology to the table to help build the fastest car, plain and simple. And as a result, a lot of the features that we enjoy in cars today, like 4-wheel drive, turbocharging, or semi-automatic gearboxes, would first see the light of day in Group B. In the early days, any cars that you saw racing in the WRC were basically cars that you could buy straight from the dealer's lot. This is because WRC had a rule that in order to build a car to be able to race in their series, the manufacturer had to make at least 5,000 of that same car to be available for sale to the general public. This made cars like the Lancia Stratos from the 1970s some of the most famous and most recognizable race cars ever made. I mean, just look at it. Look at those lines. It's incredible. But going into the 1980s, the rules in different divisions of rally had gotten so restrictive that manufacturers no longer thought that it was worth it to go through the trouble of making thousands of cars just to be able to compete. This is what the FIA wanted to change when they created the Group B class. Bring manufacturers in, let them do whatever they want, and let whatever happens, happen. Along with the new rules, or lack thereof, going into 1982, it was stated that instead of having to make 5,000 cars in order to run in the WRC, now you only had to make 200, which is nothing. And if you change something on your design from one year into the next, you only had to make 20 cars that reflect that change. A laughably low limit that, along with the lack of restrictions with overall design, would lead to a slurry of different manufacturers with new designs coming in to compete. Toyota, Ford, Renault, Audi, Lancia, Porsche, Metro, Peugeot, you name it. Even the Soviets were getting in on the action, but they never saw much success because they had other problems to deal with in the 80s. Lancia would take the Drivers' Championship out of the gate in 1982 with their 037 design, which was the spiritual successor to the legendary Stratos. It was a special one because that would mark the last time that a rear-wheel drive car would ever win in the WRC. It was powered by a mid-mounted, supercharged 250 horsepower engine, which doesn't sound like a lot, but considering that the car was made out of fiberglass and only weighed in at just over 970 kilograms or 2,100 pounds, this little car could haul. But as rapid as this car was, it just wasn't able to effectively put the power down on loose surfaces, which would lead to them losing the Constructors' Championship that same year. And that's all thanks to Audi. Anybody who knows anything about cars knows the name Quattro, and you owe all of that to Group B. This was one of the most innovative rally cars of all time. Despite being significantly heavier than Lancia, weighing almost 2,500 pounds, because Audi came with a whole lot more power and a way to actually be able to put it down reliably on loose surfaces, Quattro became unstoppable. On top of that, Audi would regularly bring huge upgrades to their car year after year. When they showed up with the Sport Quattro S1 in 1984, it was all over for the competition. It had a 5-cylinder turbocharged engine that produced over 450 horsepower, had a small valve that could keep the turbo spooled even when the driver was off throttle, and an aggressive aero package to go along with it. This aero package allowed the car to take corners at speeds unimaginable just a few years earlier. Needless to say, Audi was unstoppable. They would shave seconds, sometimes even minutes off of stage times and take both championships that year. But the dominance wouldn't last. That was because Peugeot would soon come with an answer to Audi's Quattro system when they brought a 4-wheel drive system of their own, but packaged it much more efficiently. It was built to resemble a small hatchback, their road-going 205. This meant that the car had a super short wheelbase, making it more responsive in slow-speed corners, which came at the cost of high-speed stability. But due to the tight and twitchy nature of rally circuits, this strategy is something that would pay off big for them. And a lot of the other manufacturers would quickly follow suit, creating high-power, short-wheelbase cars with mid or rear-mounted engines and low centers of gravity. along with as much downforce as they could shove on top. MG created the Metro, Renault created the S5, and when Lancia finally joined the four-wheel drive train with their Delta S4, it would again put Lancia on top. They would develop an engine with an ingenious twin-charging system. It was turbocharged and supercharged, eliminating turbo lag entirely. This was ingenious and very effective at getting the car out of slow-speed corners. The cars kept getting faster and faster and faster, and all while this was going on, Group B was exploding in popularity, quickly becoming the most watched motorsport in the world, more fans than even Formula 1 tuning in or showing up to the stages. But why are fans allowed so close to the track? Clearly, this is a disaster waiting to happen, and there were more than a few close calls, with cars regularly showing up back in between stages with blood, hair, and sometimes even fingers in the grills and air ducts of the cars. But with the cars getting faster and faster and more difficult to control year after year, what is with all these people? This is insane. I thought the Isle of Man TT was crazy, but that's nothing compared to this madness. Well, remember when I called this a track? That's the thing, this isn't a track, it's a public road. All of the stages were held on public roads, and spectators could just stand wherever they wanted to because the FIA refused to put any sort of barriers or protections in place. Which, yeah, I'm sure that was part of the charm in the early days of the WRC and was awesome. But with cars taking corners at over 100 miles an hour with thousands of spectators all crowded together, each trying to get a view of the action, I think it's safe to say it got a little out of hand. People did get hit. It wasn't uncommon. It was even considered to be part of the challenge for the drivers. But of course, these are racing drivers after all, so at the end of the day, they're going to keep it pinned and push it as much as they can wherever it might be possible. This meant just hoping that the fans would get out of the way in time, and sometimes that didn't happen, and it was only a matter of time before there was a disaster. The drivers knew this, the manufacturers knew this, the crews knew this, but no matter what they would do or say, the FIA would do nothing to try and fix this ever-growing danger. Group B had gotten too big, too popular, nothing was going to slow that train down. Mark U. Allen, driver of the Lancia Delta S4 in 1986, was never the type of person to chase the spotlight. So when he appeared voluntarily in front of the Portuguese media for the third round of the 1986 WRC Championship, you knew something was going on. He had one very clear message: stay off the road. The popularity of rally in Portugal, just like everywhere else, had grown considerably during the Group B era in the 1980s. The stages would flood with 200, 300, even 400,000 fans, all trying to show up and cheer on their heroes. And every single one of them wants to get a glimpse of the action. Within minutes of the start of the Portugal stage, Walter Röhrl would barely miss out on a spectator running across the road in front of his Audi Quattro E2, missing him by millimeters. Later on in the stage, Timo Salonen would collide with the cameraman, who had gotten shoved onto the road on the exit of a fast corner because there was simply nowhere else for him to be. The cameraman would survive, but with a bunch of broken bones, and his camera would go flying into the crowd in a bunch of pieces. Salonen's car would suffer some bodywork damage, but nevertheless was able to finish the remainder of the stage. The teams and the crews were up in arms about this incident, complaining how they always did about the complete and utter lack of crowd control. Officials at the end of the stage would listen to these complaints like they always had, but as was always the case, they would fall on deaf ears and nothing would be done. Up to this point, this was all just part of the sport. Right around this time, Joaquin Santos' Ford RS200 would leave the start. One of Portugal's best-known drivers. Thousands of fans had shown up just to cheer him on, especially in 1986, because after years in an Escort RS, he finally found himself in the Blue Oval's rocket ship for the season. This was his moment, his home round in the championship, his chance to show what he could do given the right equipment. Everything had started off well enough, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. At the fastest part of the stage, at a speed of almost 120 miles an hour, you had a slight right-hand bend that was following a long straightaway. Santos was able to take this bend nearly flat out. When Santos got to this section of the stage, there was a wall of people on both sides, something that the drivers had gotten accustomed to seeing by this point. Except after Santos came out of the right-hand bend, a spectator would step out onto the tarmac, leading to Santos having to swerve out of the way to avoid hitting him. But at the speeds he was going, the correction that he made and subsequent overcorrection to avoid hitting this guy would lead to the rear end of his car breaking loose, and he lost it. This would send the car flying at almost 120 miles an hour straight into that wall of people. 3 would die on the spot, with 32 others being sent to the hospital with serious injuries. And this is where the story takes another dark turn. Mark Duez in his MG Metro was next to go after Santos. During this period of rally, it was the accepted way of thinking that if you saw an accident, you keep going, you keep pushing, and then you warn the officials when you get to the next radio point. As such, when Mark got to the scene of the accident, he kept going. And once he made it to the next radio point and he told officials what he had seen and that they needed to stop the event, they didn't. 11 more cars would run the stage at racing speeds, much to the disbelief of both the crews and the crowds. After the stage was completed, the crews would try and band together and boycott the remainder of the rally, finally feeling that enough was enough and something finally needed to be done to stop this madness. But after threats of disciplinary action from the FIA for any teams or crews that didn't want to race, the rally continued, but not for very long, because at the Corsa rally just 2 short months later in May, Henry Tovonen and his co-driver Sergio Cresto would go off at a fast corner where there was no guardrail. They would plummet down a steep hill, which would result in a ruptured fuel tank and one big inferno to go along with it. Drivers left completing the segment would alert officials to the fire that they had seen while completing their runs, and by the time help got to the scene of the accident, there was almost nothing left to be found. At this point, it wasn't just drivers who were upset. Action was being demanded by both manufacturers and even governments, because a lack of action at this point was almost criminal. Something needed to be done, and something was. Group B was immediately banned from competition, and that was the last time we'll ever get to see these incredible machines being pushed to their absolute limits. But I think that's for the best. It was a terrifying, albeit beautiful and glorious time for racing. Racing that we'll probably never see again. The modern day WRC is still incredible. It's still fast, it's still dangerous, it's still crazy, it's still glorious. But Group B was really the era of rally that was too dangerous to exist.